So good evening again, everyone. Thank you for being here. This is the second of the three series that we're currently running, and we're very excited to continue the exploration of Hinduism as part of the Lil Faider Interfaith Scholar in Residence program. This, too, will be online at some point in the near future, so like me, you'll appreciate the opportunity to go back over material and to help reinforce some of the good teaching that will be treated to this evening. So without further ado, Dr. Ruparel, nice to have you again.
Thank you, Rabbi, and thank you all for coming again tonight. I see some familiar faces from previous times and also some new ones. So I hope what I have to say is of interest to you. Last time I spent some time talking about the origins and foundations of Hinduism towards what I'm suggesting is one form or one view of what a Hindu view of life might be. Today I want to talk a little bit about how those foundations bleed over into more recent periods that were still fairly far back. And next week we'll finally get to more contemporary times. But I wanted to get across the idea of how early forms of Hinduism, early practices and beliefs are carried forward. They're never truly lost. They change form and develop, but you can still see the tracks of the very most ancient forms of Hindu belief and practice in later centuries. So today I want to talk about how nothing really is lost, and in that sense I want to provide what I would call a kind of accretion theory or accretion model of Hinduism. I've shown you the picture on the top left many times of the ancient banyan tree in Calcutta, and below there is just simply a kind of picture of sedimentary accretion. This is really how we should be thinking about Hinduism, not only in terms of a wide diversity, as it were, synchronically at the same time. There's a lot of diversity within the tradition, but also a great diversity and continuity in time, or diachronically, through history. And so within Hinduism, or the umbrella term we use, Hinduism, we really see a continuous development, sediment after sediment laid down from the very earliest Harappan civilization, which we looked at last time. And dating is always a little bit difficult, but let's say somewhere between the 9th and 12th century BCE, through what we call the Vedic and the Brahminical periods, which would go from anywhere from about the 9th to the 2nd century BCE, to the classical, which I'll spend most of my time talking about today, and that typically is from about the 2nd century BCE to about the 4th century in the Common Era, and then we have the medieval and modern periods. Now, as I said, Hinduism is very diverse and very sort of continuous, both through diversity on a kind of synchronic level, but also diachronically. And anything in history is going to change. We all know that. One of the things that we should be thinking about in terms of the diachronic, the historical development of Hindu traditions, is how Hinduism has engaged with the religious other, how Hinduism has reacted, I suppose, or engaged with the arrival of non-Indian traditions. Now, this is not particularly straightforward, because some of the most important accommodations that Hinduism has made, some of the most important reactions and engagements were with Indian traditions. But they were so different as to be their religious others. So we can think of, for instance, in the 5th century, both the traditions of Jainism and Buddhism are both Indian traditions, but they are consciously contrary to the Orthodox Hindu traditions of the time. We also have incursion, or not incursion, but the engagement of another ancient tradition, Zoroastrianism, which eventually became what we call, what Hindus or Indians now refer to as the Parsis, the Persians. So there's an engagement with Zoroastrianism from Iran or from Persia. And again, that was fairly early on, probably in the 3rd or 4th century BCE. The idea that all these traditions create a kind of challenge for religious accommodation is actually something that we'll see in all sorts of traditions. In Hinduism, because of the kind of polycentric or multi-perspectival nature of Hinduism, that is, many different perspectives, all different yet one, we would expect, I think, to see this challenge of other traditions to be taken in stride, as it were. So in religious accommodation terms, we can see, in fact, lots of instances in which the classical Hindu tradition simply accepts and co-opts or adopts the traditions which were at one point challenges to the tradition. So on the left there, this is a temple in LA. And you can see lots of particular statues. They're called murtis. A murti literally means an image or an icon. And these are, as it were, aids to worship, aids to meditation. But you can see the arrow there on the left-hand side is a statue of the Buddha. And on the right, of course, we see a painting where Jesus and the deity Ganesha, the elephant-headed deity, are sort of buddies, brothers in arms as well. And this is fairly typical of Hindu temples and Hindu tradition generally, where a challenge or an engagement from the other takes place. It is very likely that this challenge will be kind of accepted. The family of Hindu deities, the family or the collection of Hindu concepts and practices will be expanded to include the challenge tradition. Now, of course, this doesn't happen for all traditions, particularly traditions for whom the question of multiple icons is anathema. So, of course, for Islam, you would never see a Hindu temple with a picture of Muhammad, for instance. It's probably, when I say you never, I'm sure there's one at least somewhere around, right? But typically you would not find that. You certainly do see it for Christians. To my knowledge, there are no depictions, icons, or pictures of any of the patriarchs in Judaism, of Moses or Abraham or anyone like that. But you do find in certain parts of India images that hearken to images, for instance, of the Chinese ancestors, those typically sort of rotund icons of the ancestors. So this is kind of a common way for Hinduism to engage with other religions through history. Now, as I said, it's a kind of adoption. Maybe you could call it co-opting. It could be an appropriation. For Hindus, it's not seen to be a negative thing, although I can see how other traditions or others might see it as Hinduism being a kind of all-inclusive, homogenizing tradition that sort of just swallows up everything around it. And you can see how that might be seen as a rather negative thing. For Hindus, however, this is not seen as a negative thing. It really is, for them, a reflection of their belief that Hinduism is the eternal, the universal Dharma. And you can see this kind of universalizing tendency in other traditions as well. In classical traditions, so we're going to spend most of our time talking about the classical period now, not the remnants, but the ripples of earlier forms of Hinduism are seen, and I want to suggest particularly seen, in what are called the 6 Orthodox Pramanas, or Pramanas meaning the ways of knowing or means of knowledge. Now, as a philosopher, I'm particularly interested in these things. Anthropologists, sociologists, archaeologists would probably show you different ways in which some of these ancient practices and beliefs are reflected in the material culture or the social structures of Hinduism in the classical period. But for my purposes, I want to talk about how these particular ways of knowing, these particular concepts and ideas are reflected and continue to ripple up in time. The Pramanas are 6. They are the Nyaya, and these are all separate kinds of schools of thought. The Nyaya, the Vaisheshika, the Sankhya, Yoga, Purva Mimamsa, and the Uttara Mimamsa. The Uttara Mimamsa is sometimes known as Vedanta. Now, I'm not going to talk about all of them in great detail, and in fact, these 6 have generally been categorized or amalgamated into 3 bigger traditions. So we'll look at the Nyaya Vaisheshika, the Sankhya Yoga, and the Mimamsa traditions. So the Nyaya Vaisheshika school, again, it's a conglomeration of 2 schools, and Nyaya really is one of the oldest traditions. It really literally means rules of judgment, and it refers to a kind of logical school. So in Nyaya, you get the first developments of systems of logic. The dates here are probably in the 4th or 5th century before the Common Era. And interestingly, the logical developments, the logical systems that are developed here tend to get adopted by other schools. They become the foundations for basic understandings of philosophy and logic. The Nyaya school accepts some basic ideas about how you know things, so you can learn and you can know things truly through perception, through inference or logic, through comparison and analogy, and finally through testimony. And I say there's a 4-valued logic because this is something of particular interest to me. In Western logic that Aristotle developed in the Greek period, we have 2 values, two values for logic, or 2 values for 2 logical operators. There's true and there's false. But for Indian traditions, and this would include then Jainism, Buddhism as well, and later traditions such as Sikhism, they really have a 4-valued logic. There's true, there's false, there's both, and there's neither. So every statement could either be true or false, or both, or neither. And you can also have combinations. You can be false and both, true and neither, and it all becomes really very complicated very quickly. And you can imagine how, if you had a logic that says a statement could be both true and false, or neither true nor false, you could see how, if that is at the foundation of your way of understanding the universe, then suddenly your universe becomes much more complicated. Everything that you think about, everything that you can point to and ask a question, is this true or false? People can say, well, it could be both or neither. It could be true or false. And you can see I'm kind of shaking my head, as a good Indian would do. When Indians do that, it's a coded form of saying, yeah, but, sure, okay, right? It's a very typical thing in India to see, and I mean, I'm really generalizing here, but I think this 4-valued logic can explain a lot about how Indian society is developed. If you can have both and neither as legitimate ways to answer a question that we might say is either yes or no, true or false, then, as I say, the world gets very much more complex. There's lots of nuances. Perspectivalism comes into play. All sorts of other relativizing factors, I suppose, come into play here. So Nyaya is really interesting. I think one of my current research projects is to see how Hindu or Indian ways of interpretation, rules of interpretation, sort of arise out of this kind of logical scheme. The Vaisheshika tradition is what's called the atomistic school. It is a naturalistic atomistic school. Again, it develops around the 4th century or so, perhaps a little bit earlier, maybe up to the 6th century BCE. It's naturalistic in the sense that it doesn't believe that there is anything beyond the natural. It doesn't believe in supernatural entities, for instance. And it's atomistic in that it has a very well-developed atomic theory. So in the 3rd or 4th century, we have long discourses about the nature of the universe being composed of what they call anumana, which is the term for atom. And these atoms, in the same way that our atomic theory looks at it, are the fundamental building blocks of the universe, and they are indivisible. Interestingly, for the Vaisheshikans, one of the categories or one of the characteristics of anumana, are these atoms, is a basic form of consciousness. And so for Indians, the very foundation of the universe includes mind, includes consciousness. And as I said, the Nyaya school, their logic gets incorporated into other schools. The atomistic Vaisheshikans, not so much. While this is an early form of atomism, there are other traditions which we'll talk about which depart from this view. The Vaisheshikans accept perception and influence or inference, logic and our perceptions as the only valid form of understanding. And they believe that all reality can only be explained through looking at the natural world. You don't need gods, demons, anything else, and through atoms as the basis of substance. The Nyaya Vaisheshikans are non-theistic. Later developments eventually suggest a form of devotional practice, but really these are atheistic traditions. In fact, we will find the next set of traditions to be atheistic as well. You can be a good Hindu and be an atheist. No trouble at all. As well as a good theist, as well as a non-theistic foundationalist. We'll get to that eventually. So there's a lot of varieties in terms of what you can believe and still be a good Hindu. It's more about how you live rather than what you believe. The true way, or the way to liberation or release from the round of birth and rebirth is insight, is understanding and knowledge. So I'm not going to spend much time on them. Let's talk about Sankhya and Yoga. These are two traditions which you probably have come across in one way or another. Right, oops, I think I lost one thing. These are, as I said, originally two schools. They are now combined. They started with the Sankhya Sutra by a fellow named Kapila around the 6th century BCE. And the most important text really is probably the Sankhya Karika of Ishvara Krishna, which is a commentary on the first book, right? So that's around the 5th century. It's a very old tradition of thought, and we see it reflected and rippled out in lots of other places. It is a dualistic tradition in which there are two basic things in the universe, Purusha and Prakriti. And we can think about Purusha as a kind of spirit, as it were, a non-material substance. It is completely separate from material substance, Prakriti. And these are both eternal. Some people suggest that Prakriti came originally from Purusha, that is, matter came from spirit, but both are co-eternal, so it really doesn't matter which came from which. The Prakriti, the material reality, is composed of what they call three gunas. A guna literally means quality. So there are three qualities to substance, to the material world, including our bodies and everything else. So the gunas, literally, as I said, qualities or characteristics. They are the ways in which the nature of any given body is determined, right? These qualities determine what they are. And the three gunas are this: sattva, which refers to true or fine, light, pure things. Raja, or rajas, dynamic, energetic, and active qualities, and tamas, dull, stolid, heavy, and impure characteristics. Right? So these are all qualities. The gunas are not simply qualities in and of themselves, they are qualities of the composites of matter. Right? I won't go into all of the details here, but we're not talking about things that we impose or we perceive about material things. They're kind of the constituents of matter, right? So all three gunas are always there, right? Different amounts of them will determine the characteristics of the material entity, right? And it really is a matter of kind of a balance here. Something, anything, will have all three gunas, qualities, in different proportions. So this glass of water, right, would be mostly sattvic, right? It's pure, light, clear, it's health-giving. It's not particularly rajasic, it's not particularly energetic. It doesn't produce lots of energy, but it's required for energy, so it has a little bit, right? And because it's solid in some ways, right? It's, in the glass rather than vapor in the air. Right now it has some tamasic qualities. It's solid. It's not kind of ethereal, as it were, right? Everything can be understood as a conglomeration of these various qualities. They believe in a term called Satkaryavada, which translates to the effect inheres in the cause. The effect, the thing, is pre-existent in the causal entities. So the qualities which give a thing its gross perceptual qualities, right? The gunas that give it to, the gunas cause the thing to be the way it is, right? And as I said, it literally means you are what you eat. And I brought this up a little bit because we see in Ayurvedic medicine and Ayurvedic diets a strong sort of focus on these qualities. Every food that you eat will be particularly rajasic or tamasic or sattvic. If you eat more sattvic things, pure, light, clear, all of these things, your body and your mind will be more pure and light and clear. Right? If you eat more energetic things, you're going to feel a lot more anxious and nervous, but you'll have a lot of energy. And if you eat tamasic things, you're going to be kind of slobby and slow, but pretty comfortable, right? What you want maybe on a winter's evening is a good tamasic stew or something like that, right? This is actually the basis of why many Hindus are vegetarian, because vegetables are sattvic generally. You eat them in order to gain those kinds of qualities. You stay away from animal proteins, animal products, because they're going to give you mostly tamasic things. They're dead flesh. Of course they're going to be tamasic, right? But they're also rajasic. There's a lot of energy in them. And so you see sometimes particular sectors of Hindus, particular, classes, I suppose, of Hindus who will suggest that, no, you really ought to eat meat because it gives you energy. It makes you virile and strong. Who would want to eat that sort of stuff? Those people who typically are in the military or are interested in having really strong bodies. So vegetarianism has a kind of logic to it. It's not purely a matter of, a law saying don't eat meat. In fact, in the Vedas, there's all kinds of meat eating. There's animal sacrifice, all kinds of stuff. But as it develops, there's a kind of logic to people's understanding of material nature, right? And this is one of the reasons why many Hindus are vegetarian. You literally are what you eat. Interestingly, there are some vegetables that don't count as sattvic, the ones that come out of the ground. So things like onions and garlic. Now, if you've gone to an Indian restaurant, you have to wonder how the heck they can make anything in Indian food without onions and garlic. It's kind of the basis of everything. So interestingly, if you go to India, you will find certain plants that aren't in the ground, but they taste exactly like onions and garlic, little shrubs. I've been to Vedic gardens where you walk around, you pick a leaf, and you eat it, and you think, boy, that tastes exactly like garlic. And that's what they use to flavor food, for instance. So, Sankhya, let's look at this. Remember I told you it's a dualistic tradition. The goal is to purify Prakriti in order to realize its essential separation from Purusha. Purify the material nature in order to realize that it is essentially different and distinct from your spiritual nature. Prakriti can be purified, or rather integrated, through yoga. So yoga is what we'll talk about in a minute. Once this separation is realized, the Purusha, your spirit, is literally freed from its attachment to your body, attachment to your material self. And once it's freed from there, it achieves a type of liberation which they call kaivalya. Literally means isolation. The method for this integration and purification is yoga. So let's talk a little bit about that. The word yoga literally means integration, but it can also mean the word practice, right? So it has this dual connotation. It really refers to the integration of the body, mind, and self towards a distinction from Purusha, right? So one of the ways that yogis talk about this is the idea of a kind of unity. They give the example of a turtle. A turtle pulls its limbs in, and it becomes a singular thing, as it were. Just the shell is right. And once you see it as that singular thing, as it were, you see that it is integrated, and it can be kind of separated or distinct from the way in which a turtle will move around the world, right? Patanjali is seen to be the originator of the yoga tradition. He wrote the Yoga Sutra around the 2nd century. And the goal of yoga is this integration and isolation. Now, Patanjali's yoga has 8 limbs, or 8 stages, as it were. It's literally called Ashtanga yoga, and this is something you may have come across as well. The angas, the limbs, are as shown here. First of all, there are 2 stages, or 2 aspects, 2 limbs of yoga that really focus on the will, on our acting in the world, our decision making. Then there are 3 that refer to the body, and finally 3 more that refer to the mind. And it's understood in Ashtanga yoga that these really build on each other. The first is the will. So you have to act well in the world. You have to restrain yourself from harming, lying, stealing, acquiring acquisitiveness and lustful ideas, lustful practices. And you have to observe purification, contentment, austerity, study, and commitment. Sometimes these 2, yama and niyama, are sometimes referred to as the 10 Commandments of Hinduism, because these typically are accepted as foundational for all Hindus. If you are going to act as a good person, as a human being, you have to practice yama and niyama, restraint and observance. Now, once you've done that, you can then move on to the asanas and pranayama, the regulation of breath, and the withdrawal of senses, pratyahara. These 3 things in the middle, the body stuff, that's what you usually see at Lululemon, right? The asanas, the breath control, the breathing, and finally the kind of meditative practice where you try to still your mind and not think about too much outside of your body. It's withdrawal of the senses to the body. Now, the thing is, and I'm sorry if this is a bit of a letdown for all of you yoga practitioners, You're not going to get any good at the bodily stuff unless you're pretty good already at the willpower stuff. That's how it's built on top of each other. It's not worth trying to do all these stretches and downward dogs and all of that kind of stuff. It can be fun and it's good exercise and all of that sort of stuff, but in some ways you're taking it out of its natural development or its natural process, right? They're supposed to be there, and they're only going to be really helpful for you if you've already been working on your moral character. Right? So if you're really good at postures and regulation of breath, but you regularly steal and lie, well, yoga is not going to be helpful for you, right? In fact, the posture and the breath and the senses stuff are all there to kind of control the body. They're not really there to promote health, although that's a good sort of secondary result. They're there to control the body so that you can finally get to the stage where you are steadying the mind, you're contemplating, and finally you can achieve a kind of meditative trance. The whole reason you do all these stretches and stuff like that is so that you can sit for a long time and your body's not going to bug you. And so you can actually think and contemplate and steady your mind without feeling terrible, right? Without your back, completely seizing up, as it happens to me. So, again, the mind stuff is the goal of yoga, right? Steadying the mind, trying to focus on one thing. Contemplation is the act of meditative awareness. And the meditative trance is something, that samadhi is something that occurs to you. It's not something that kind of you can force, but in the act of dhyana, in contemplation, you may achieve a form of meditative trance or samadhi. These integrative disciplines cultivate detachment. They are trying to get you to realize the essential difference between the material reality and your spiritual reality. When the prakritic self is realized, its distinction and detachment from Purusha is made apparent. You just sort of see how they're different, right? We don't think of ourselves anymore as our bodies. We realize that we're not. Purusha is then properly isolated, and you achieve a blissful state of liberation called kaivalya. What about God? Well, Sankhya Yoga is actually atheistic. It doesn't believe in a creator God. It believes that the Lord, or Ishvara, is really there to be a kind of ideal yogi, a sort of exemplar for us. But they wouldn't talk about Ishvara as, particularly interested in us or interested in the world. Ishvara is the goal to be emulated. And the deities in Sankhya Yoga are actually all part of samsara. Interestingly, for a lot of Hindu traditions, the deities that we will talk about next time, so Vishnu and Shiva and Ganesha and all these other deities, they're actually not eternal. They are part and parcel of the cycle of birth and rebirth. And in fact, they are not really persons so much as offices. So they are kind of functionaries, right? And it's actually possible for any one of us to eventually achieve that function, that office. You and I can become Vishnu. Because even Vishnu, whatever soul or Atman is there now, will eventually take its turn to be reborn, because they're part of samsara as well. So those deities, those are really kind of emanations. They are functionaries of a more deeper reality. So that's Sankhya and Yoga. And you can see how some of these basic ideas, it's a very old tradition, they will be reflected later on, but even the development of Sankhya and Yoga take on some of the early ideas of Hinduism, the foundational ideas. They do accept the idea of samsara, the cycle of birth and rebirth. They believe that karma is the sort of law of cause and effect in the universe. That's where they get their idea of satkaryavada, the effect inhering in the cause. They believe in the idea that we have some kind of what we might call our true selves, whether we call them atmans or purushas. There's a number of different terms for them. These are all fairly ancient ideas which get developed and show a certain kind of development or fluorescence in Sankhya and Yoga. So let's move on to the Mimamsa traditions. So there are two, Purva Mimamsa and Uttara Mimamsa, or what's sometimes called Vedanta. Purva Mimamsa is kind of the old school of investigation, and Uttara Mimamsa is the later school of investigation. So Mimamsa literally means that word, investigation. They are both theological in ways that the Nyaya Vaisheshika and the Sankhya Yoga traditions are not, right? So both of these traditions do have a theology. They do believe in God as a creator in some form or another. And so as I say, they are theistic. They all accept the authority of the Vedic scriptures. And while Purva Mimamsa is earlier, as I said, Vedanta or Uttara Mimamsa is later. The word Vedanta literally means the end of the Vedas. And it's the end of the Vedas in two ways, which I'll explain later. So let's look at the Purva Mimamsa. This tradition is really focused on ritual and sacrifice. And it therefore connects back to some of the earlier forms of sacrifice and ritual that you see in early Hinduism. So earlier on I showed that there was Harappan and Vedic and then eventually Brahminical Hinduism. So this really refers back to Brahminical and Vedic Hinduism. Their basic idea is that sacrifice yields fruit. You get stuff if you sacrifice. And in fact, sacrifice is the primary function of human beings on earth. The main texts are the earliest Vedic texts, the Samhitas, so the Rig Veda Samhita, for instance, and the Brahmanas. The Brahmanas, you might remember, are the texts which talk about how to perform the various rituals that you find in the Samhitas. And the Samhitas were the oldest ones, then the Brahmanas, then the forest texts, the Aranyakas, and finally the Upanishads. I realize this is a lot to take in. We'll get to some more interesting stuff in a minute, but we do have to go through some of this just so you have some basic ideas about how classical Hinduism works. The major text is from the 3rd and 4th, around the 4th century BCE. All right, the Purva Mimamsas are realist and pluralist. That is, they think that the world really is real, right? We have real things. It's not a kind of appearance, as it were. In this sense, they are similar to the Nyaya Vaisheshikans, right? They think that the world really is there, that's made out of substance and atoms and things like that. It's pluralist in that not everything is the same thing. There are real differences in the world. It accepts the authority of the Vedas, and it understands Brahman, the word we use to describe the fundamental reality. It understands the world as particularized Brahma or Brahman, right? So if Brahman is the ultimate reality, then Brahman appears, or is not appearing, but it is instantiated, it is made particular in things like us and everything that exists. We're all part and parcel of Brahman. Sometimes we might think of this as a kind of pantheistic tradition. Everything that exists is real and is part and parcel of Brahman. Right? They have an idea that all of this difference is still part and parcel of one nature, one ultimate reality, which they would call Brahman. So they have this notion of tadatmya, identity in difference. Even though there really are truly distinct different things, we are still identified in certain ways. The deities here are just other particularized selves, just like us, right? The deities are still beholden to sacrifice. So the various deities that people pray to in Hinduism, they themselves have to sacrifice as well. The reason for sacrifice is, as we'll see in a minute, a more fundamental order of the universe. The Purva Mimamsikas will accept the Vedas. They believe that the Vedas are part of an objective reality, that they are apurusheya, meaning beginningless or authorless, and they are sui generis. They can't be compared to anything else. The Vedas can't be in conflict with anything that we know, because by definition, the Vedas deals with the unseen realities. And remember, the Vaisheshikans would disagree. They would say that there is no unseen reality. If it's not seen, it doesn't exist. Whereas for the Mimamsikas, they do believe in a kind of supernatural reality, but one that is actually real. Dharma is, for the Purva Mimamsikas, it primarily stands for these rites and ritual duties. The moral purity of people is assumed, so our job really is to maintain ritual order in the universe. When we maintain ritual order, what we're doing, according to these guys, is we are keeping the universe ticking over. It literally requires us to do rituals, to perform certain kinds of sacrifices in order for the universe to keep going. It's kind of, ritual becomes the sort of energetic motor for the entire universe. And in that sense, they believe that the whole goal of creation is for us to play our part by keeping it going. The way we play our part, do the sacrifices and rituals, right? And again, it sort of makes sense because they're focusing on the earliest forms of Hinduism, which are primarily about ritual and sacrifice. Right? There are various duties, what are called obligatory duties, nitya karma, and the specific duties, the varnashrama dharma, and finally general duties, kamya karma. So these are all things we must do. They have ritual aspects, there's sacrifices involved, some things all of us have to do, for instance, the yama and niyama aspects, the 10 Commandments, as I said, observance and restraint. Then there are specific things, varnashrama dharma. And this is actually kind of a complicated idea. I'll spend more time next week talking about this. But just briefly, these specific duties are requirements for you and me at different times in our lives and in different, at different stages in our lives, different times in our lives, but also different ones for different roles in society. And varnashrama dharma, in fact, is one of the places where we see the idea of caste in Hinduism developing. So we'll spend more time talking about that next week, but it comes out of an idea that all of these duties and responsibilities we have to keep the universe going, to sacrifice in the right way, to do rituals, there's ones that everybody has to do, but there's also ones that are very specific to you at various times and various ways in life. Moksha, or liberation, really is not the true aim in life. It's merely an effect and a result of doing your duties, doing your dharma, doing your role in the universe, right? So all the rituals and duties, they are things that you have to do. We all have to pay our taxes. We all have to raise children. We all have to look after the environment. We have to look after those who are less fortunate than we are. All of these things we can think about as duties, and ritual in the sense that you do them in some ways repetitively and even without looking for the benefits of them. You do them because you do them, not because of the benefits that you accrue. You do them for the sake of doing them. Dharma is upheld by sacrifice, and this is the real point of existence. All right, last one. Vedanta. This is the most popular one. It's focused on the later texts of the Vedas, these forest texts, the Aranyakas and the Upanishads. They tend to be more philosophical and more reflective, and there are three major schools of them: Advaita, Vishishtadvaita, and Dvaita. And Advaita, the main guy there is a guy named Shankara around the 8th century. Vishishtadvaita, the main guy is Ramanuja around the 12th century. And Dvaita, the main guy is Madhva, the 13th century. Advaita literally means non-dual. So Dvaita, at the bottom there, would mean dual. And Vishishtadvaita means qualified non-dual. Right? We'll get to these in a minute. All three schools focus on the Upanishads, another text called the Brahma Sutra, and the Bhagavad Gita, particularly in what are called the Mahavakyas, the great sayings that are found in these three texts. So Advaita, as I said, is really propounded by the 8th century scholar and saint Shankara. It believes that the universe is all one. It's not two, non-dual. Everything is identical to Brahman. So really, for Shankara, nothing exists except for Brahman. Brahman is the one without a second. Brahman, remember, is the word they use for ultimate reality. If everything is Brahman, then how is it that we apparently experience lots of differences? Why do we experience everything as separate and different when in fact it's all one thing? So for Shankara, he has to try to explain these apparent differences. And his response is that we're really just ignorant. We're fundamentally mistaken in how we experience the world. What he thinks is it really exists is nirguna Brahman, quality-less reality, what sometimes is referred to as the Godhead or the noumenon. This world that we experience is then saguna Brahman, Brahman in its qualitied or particularized form, the phenomenal appearance of Brahman. It makes sense of a particular phrase, one of these Mahavakyas, the great sayings, in the Chandogya Upanishad, Tat Tvam Asi. It literally means, thou art that. You are Brahman. You are the ultimate reality. It's one of the kind of key teachings of Vedanta. Brahman itself is not this, not this. What they say, neti, neti. It's not this, it's not this. Meaning, it's not the world, it's not this, it's not you. It's nothing, no thing in the universe. It's prior to things, right? You can still talk about Brahman in particular positive ways through revelation. So the Upanishads do have positive ways to describe ultimate reality rather than not this, not this, not this. They talk about it in terms of Satchitananda, literally meaning real consciousness and bliss. That's the approved way of thinking about Brahman. But the big question for Vedanta, for Advaita particularly, is how is it that we are deluded? How is it that we are mistaken about all of our experience, all of our knowledge? Well, their response is through these two terms, Maya and Lila. And the view of creation, the view of the idea of creation or emanation is that Brahman self-evolves into plurality. Being one, let me become many. Right? Now, that creation, that development is so mind-blowing, it's so beguiling that we get fooled. It's just like we are watching a magic trick, right? A magician can do something and we cannot believe our eyes. We have just been fooled into thinking that something is real when it isn't, right? Exactly the same way. the power of Brahman, or the effect of Brahman's self-creation into the universe, or as the universe, is beguiling. And why does Brahman do this? The term is lila. It's an overflowing, joyful play of creation. There is no real reason for Brahman doing this. As I said a few times ago, Brahman is actually acting for no reason at all. And there's a reason, there's a sensibility to this. If Brahman was acting to achieve something for a particular purpose, it would imply that Brahman did not have that purpose to begin with, hadn't achieved that purpose. And Brahman, by definition, is everything, is ultimate reality. All purposes are already there. So Brahman's activity must literally be purposeless. And what do we understand by purposeless activity? Play. Right? If you've ever watched your kids play around, or your grandkids play around, they're running around like idiots, chickens with their heads cut off. They're not doing anything for a purpose. They're just playing. They're just acting for the joy of it. Right? And that's the idea that Leela connotes. Vishishta-Advaita, the second one's propounded by Ramanuja in the 12th century. And it literally is this kind of non-duality of particulars, or a kind of qualified non-duality. It believes Brahman is not without qualities, nirguna. He believes that Brahman has infinite perfections, infinite qualities. So Ramanuja's main problem isn't really to try to account for unity like Shankara does. He actually has to explain how all these differences come from a unified Brahman. And he has a really interesting way of thinking about it. He suggests that the universe is the body of Brahman. Now, this isn't the same thing as pantheism. It's not to say that when you account for all of the universe, you've accounted completely for Brahman. Rather, he uses this metaphor of the body to think about how the universe and Brahman are related. So the universe is to Brahman as our bodies are to our true selves. Hindus don't believe, or at least the Vedantins don't believe, that you are nothing more than your body. You are more than that. You have a true self. We sometimes think about these as souls, but that's probably not a very good translation. We really should think about them as true selves. The word they use is Atman, A-T-M-A-N, Atman. And so to think about the universe and Brahman's Brahman's creation of it is really to sort of imagine the universe as different and distinct and plural, just as our bodies are different, right? We have different parts of our bodies. Yet at the same time, there's a unity as well. And at the same time, we are not the same thing as our bodies. We are more than that. So Brahman is the universe, but Brahman exceeds the universe. And that is what in the West we would call panentheism rather than pantheism. The idea that everything is in God rather than everything is God. All right. Okay, so that's your philosophy for today. And I know that's a lot to handle, and there's lots of terms that you might want to go over again. What I was trying to get at here is at least two things. One, that these traditions harken back to earlier forms. They harken back to earlier interests in the Vedic material. So in the Purva Mimamsa, we see a real interest in the ritual aspects of the universe, ritual aspects of the Vedas. In the Uttara or the Vedanta traditions, we have a much more focus on the reflective and conceptual aspects of the Vedic material. Sankhya Yoga, we actually refer back prior to some of these Vedic materials to think about the universe as purely material and spiritual, this kind of dualism, right? And of course, in the Nyaya Vaisheshika traditions, they're really just foundational logical and epistemological schools. So, where do we see all of this kind of developing? Well, I want to talk finally about the Bhagavad Gita. And we'll spend a bit more time next week as well talking about this. But the Gita is a really good example of how all of these ideas and traditions are kind of encapsulated and brought forward into later history. So the Bhagavad Gita, or the Song of the Divine, is a text within a larger text. It is a text of about 18 chapters. It's quite short. The book is only probably about 90 pages at best. And it's a section right in the middle of a much larger text called the Mahabharata, which we'll talk about next time. The Mahabharata is the world's longest epic poem at about 100,000 verses. And it's very complicated because it has existed for a long time. It's gone through a long history, but a lot of different variations. And it's still, in some ways, a living tradition. In oral cultures, you have this idea of traveling bards going around reciting these stories, these old poems, these old stories, epics, for the entertainment and education of the people. And the Mahabharata is like that. The interesting thing about the Mahabharata, though, as well as the Ramayana, the other major epic of Hinduism, is that there are still people in India doing that sort of work. There are still bards going from village to village, from town to town, reciting huge chunks of these stories. And as they do so, sometimes they add little bits, pieces here. They bring a bit of local flavor into things. They entertain the audience by referring to some local characters, perhaps. It's still a lively tradition. It's not, for instance, like the Iliad or the Odyssey, which are long dead. All right. The background. Well, the Gita is one of the most popular texts, the religious texts of Hinduism. It is read by almost all varieties of Hindus. It's sometimes considered the fifth Veda. Remember, there are 4 Vedas, the Rig, the Sama, the Yajur, and the Atharva. Sometimes, as a kind of honorific, the Gita is seen to be the 5th Veda, the 5th authorized source of salvific knowledge. It's compiled from an oral tradition, probably at least from the 800s to the 300s BCE, and it comes to its kind of accepted or current state in the classical period, 200 to 100. The oral tradition is really evident in this plurality of styles and messages. It assuredly was multiply authored, and we see that because of the different literary structures as well as the plurality of messages in the book. Right? Now, many Hindus would contest this. They would say, no, it was written by one person in a divine revelation. Scholars would disagree. They would look at it differently, I think. The Gita forms, as I said, this middle section of the Mahabharata. It's one of these huge texts, and it's considered one of the minor books of the Mahabharata. It was probably added into the Mahabharata around the 3rd century. So it probably existed as a story in and of itself, which got pulled into this bigger epic. The Mahabharata is the story of a family feud between the Kuru clan it's the story of the Kuru clan and 2 sets of cousins, the Pandavas and the Kauravas. And the Pandavas and the Kauravas are at war, right? The Pandavas are 5 brothers, and the Kauravas are 100 brothers. So you'd think that they might be outnumbered, but in fact, the Pandavas have some divine help. The problem really, the thing that they're worried about is who's going to take the throne, right? So that's really what the problem is. Sorry, I've gone back too far here. Problem is ascension to the throne. So here's a really simple background for the Mahabharata. Yudhishthira, the righteous leader of the Pandavas, loses his kingdom to his 100 cousins, the Kauravas, in a crooked game of dice. And the penalty was a 14-year exile. After a 14-year exile, as part of the bet, the Pandavas, or the Pandus sometimes called, return to claim their half of the kingdom, but they are refused even 5 villages to live in themselves. With no other recourse, a war becomes imminent. Krishna, who is a neighboring king and a cousin to both the Kauravas and the Pandavas, offers his help to both sides. Krishna's army, the Kauravas say, okay, we'll take your help, we'll take your army. So the army goes to the Kaurava side while Krishna himself goes to the Pandavas, the Pandu side, to help them. And he said he would only help as a non-combatant. He would just drive a chariot. That's all he would do. He drives the chariot to Arjuna, who is the middle Pandava brother. So this war eventually, there's a lot of discussion about trying to negotiate and avoid the war, but eventually nothing works and the two armies are arrayed against each other. The Pandavas on one side, the Kauravas on the other. The Pandavas, the five brothers, are Yudhishthira, the oldest one, Bhima, Arjuna, the middle one, and Nakula and Sahadeva are twin youngest brothers. And the Kauravas are the oldest one, Duryodhana, and they never really mention too many of the brothers. There's too many of them. So they just simply say, and his 99 brothers. Right? Krishna is in this, and he, as I said, promises to act for the Pandavas, but only as a chariot driver for Arjuna. And he is also kind of a confidant or a consigliere, as it were, to the Pandavas. Another main character, Bhishma, is a kind of grandfather figure for both the sets of cousins, and he was in fact in charge of kind of raising them all. He trained them all as princes and kings and warriors. So that's the story of the Mahabharata. These are the main characters. We'll spend a bit of time talking about this story next time because it's huge. We could spend the next 3 years talking about this story. In fact, if you're really interested, you can watch on YouTube a year-long mini-series. Each episode lasts about an hour and a half, going through the entire Mahabharata. Mostly there are subtitles, so you can read it all. If you like Bollywood movies and things like that, this is the Bollywood movie to end all of them, right? This is the greatest story ever told. And it has that ethos or that kind of feeling of a Bollywood film. Now, in the middle of the two armies arrayed like this, on the battlefield called Kurukshetra, which is just south and west of modern-day Delhi, you have Krishna and Arjuna, who take their chariot out into the middle of the battlefield to survey what's going on prior to the battle horns starting and everybody fighting. And what happens is Arjuna falls into despondency. He sees on his side all of his four brothers, and all of their armies and their allies. But then on the other side, he sees all of his cousins. They grew up together. He sees Bhishma, his kind of grandfather figure, who has joined with the Kauravas. He sees all of his loved ones all around him. And this is just before, in the myth, the greatest war to have ever taken place. And before he starts, now Arjuna is always seen to be one of the greatest warriors. He talks to his chariot driver, Krishna, and he says, I don't know what to do. He drops his bow and he just says, what do I do? And this is seen to be a myth for our experience of life. We are in the midst of a great battle. We are constantly surrounded by both friends and foes. Sometimes our friends are our foes, and we are despondent. We're confused. We don't know what to do. So Arjuna asks Krishna, what do I do? And the rest of the Gita is Krishna telling him, this is how it is. This is what you should do. And in the midst of the Gita, he gives 3 different ways, really 4 different ways of understanding our human predicament. There are competing strands in the Gita. There are questions of whether you should act or refuse to act, renounce? Should you go into the battlefield or should you try to retire? What is your duty to the society at large, but how are you going to square that with your personal integrity, your personal duty? Who is really going to win? The side of knowledge and wisdom or the side of power? Brahmins and Kshatriyas. And ultimately, there is also a kind of philosophical debate being played out in this text between Sankhya, between the dualistic view of Purusha and Prakriti, versus the non-dualistic view of Vedanta. So, Sankhya Yoga suggests that you are not what you appear to be. This is not really who you are. When you go through yoga and you integrate your body, you will see that your true spiritual self is not the same thing as your body. And your spiritual self will, as it were, be liberated and float away. Right? So if that's the case, then all you got to do, really, is play your part here. Arjuna, you're supposed to be a warrior. Go to war, right? You're not really killing anybody anyway. You're just dispatching their bodies so that their true selves will go and get reborn in another body, right? It's like you're asking them to change their clothes. They're going to put on new clothes. You're not killing anybody. You can't kill the ultimate Purusha. You can't kill the soul, right? Another way of thinking about it, another way of dealing with this problem is what's called karma yoga. Now remember, yoga can also mean path. So this sometimes is called karma, the path of karma. And it's quite similar to the Sankhya Yoga tradition. It suggests that you should do your duties, you should act in the world, but most importantly, you need to act for the sake of acting alone, not for the benefits or the fruits of your action. You act without regard for the fruit of the action. That purifies your action. You're not doing it for anything, but you're simply playing your part, right? As I said, it's quite similar in that sense to the Sankhya Yoga tradition. So, Arjuna, go and do your duty. Go to war, but don't do it for your own benefit or your own glory. Do it because this is what needs to be done, right? Do your duty. Another way of thinking about it, however, is what's called the path of jnana, or knowledge. Jnana literally is the place where we get the word knowledge from. And this path is to try to meditate and understand and realize the truth. Once you realize the truth, that in fact all of us are part and parcel of one Brahman, one ultimate reality, then your participating in the war is nothing more than Brahman acting in and of itself. You are just part of Brahman. Brahman is playing. Brahman is acting for whatever reason Brahman has. Likely no reason. So again, go out and fight. You're not doing anything wrong. You're the puppet, as it were. You just do what you do, right? You're a puppet with some choice, but you're still kind of a puppet, right? And finally, the message is one of what's called bhakti yoga, or the path, or the path of bhakti, the path of loving devotion and grace. And we'll spend some more time talking about this next week. This is where most commentators, most scholars would suggest that the Gita ends up. Krishna reveals himself in the Gita to be Brahman itself. Krishna reveals himself to be the Godhead. And by doing so, he reveals to Arjuna his purpose in life. That is, through loving devotion, to worship Brahman, to worship the form of Brahman as Krishna. Through that loving devotion, Krishna promises Arjuna that when he dies, by Krishna's grace, Arjuna will achieve liberation. So this is the first place in which, in Hinduism, you really get a strong doctrine, a concept of divine grace. And it is a very big development in Hindu tradition, which we'll spend more time talking about next time. It's ultimately the thing that is promoted by the Gita, and it's the basis of medieval and modern developments of Hinduism, which we'll talk about next week. So, thanks very much. Are there any questions or comments? Sorry, I did take a long time today, so sorry, go ahead.
I have a couple of comments. Earlier on, you mentioned about the statues and the idols in the temple, and you referred to the absence of Muhammad's picture, or that it may be there somewhere, but unlikely, or whatever. My understanding, I could be mistaken, is that within Islam or something, any pictorial depiction of Muhammad is sacrilegious, it is forbidden. So you may not find Muhammad drawing even in a mosque or something. Am I right there?
Yeah, that's correct. One way that Islam might have an appearance, as it were, in a Hindu temple would not be in a picture or an icon of Muhammad, you're right. Although Hindus don't have a worry about that, depictions of deities or of saints. But you might find the Arabic script of, the Lord is one and Muhammad is his prophet. So you might see that in a Hindu temple. But again, it's unlikely.
Because even in that thing that happened in France a few years back, when they drew a cartoon of Muhammad, it was not how Muhammad was depicted, that was of course there, but the very fact that there was a pictorial thing of Muhammad, and that is taboo in
certainly taboo in Islam, but it's not in Hinduism. So Hindus would have no problems with depictions of Muhammad or any depiction of the divine reality. Allah literally means the Lord or God, right? And so Hindus have lots of depictions of what God might be. All of those icons or murtis, and I am cautious about the word idol, because that's really not what they are. An idol is something seen, a material entity which is seen as divine in itself and worthy of worship in itself. Whereas for Hindus, these depictions are merely signposts. They're pointers to a divine which cannot itself be pictured. In most Hindu temples, they don't particularly care about the actual icon. Of course, they use it as a kind of aid in worship, a way to focus their energies, but in many temples, those particular icons are traded out every year. In many Hindu temples in India, at a particular ritual in the year, they march these things out and throw them into the river. And they get another one. It's because they know that these things aren't God. These things cannot be God, right? They can only be our psychological crutch to focus our attention on something which we cannot imagine. That's what they are.
It also speaks, as we as Jews, in some teachings, many teachings, that there are 72 names of God. And in the Hindu tradition, all these different wonderful deity presentations are aspects of the ultimate Brahman. Right. So Lakshmi being the goddess of abundance.
That's right.
And Krishna being who he is, and Vishnu and the others. That I really believe, just as in Judaism sometimes there can be a misconception that a lot of people do not realize that people are not praying to Ganesh.
But we don't depict those names.
No.
No, but in the Hindu tradition, but even within our Jewish tradition, many people do not know without an icon what each name of God actually represents on the physical and spiritual plane.
That's true, but my point is that they're not depicted in any physical way.
No, but
That's right. For Hindus, they have full-fledged depictions, pictures, statues, sounds, the whole deal.
I see Moses with an elephant trunk on his face.
But most people don't know when they see Ganesh's story, where many know and others wouldn't, that it isn't about you're praying to Ganesh.
Yeah. I'll tell you the story of Ganesh next week.
Okay.
And Hanuman and a bunch of the other cool ones. Yep.
Sorry, comment number 2. Sorry. You mentioned about the war between the 5 brothers and the 100 brothers on the other side, cousins fighting amongst cousins and family fighting. And of course, the whole thing is very, very kind of interesting. I couldn't suddenly, stop to draw a parallel between what's happening today in Saudi Arabia, where the prince now is hurting his cousins and family members and others as well in a power struggle, and we don't know how that will unfold. But I thought just to myself as you were talking, wow, maybe something like that is happening today in Saudi Arabia.
But this seems more like the Armageddon.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not. This is
not a local family feud, although family feuds are pretty universal, right? Everybody has them. But this is a mythical kind of conflagration of the forces of good and evil. This is a huge Armageddon. Well, that's part of the Ramayana more than the Mahabharata. But as any kind of mythical depiction, it is larger than life. Right. It starts out probably as a kind of local feud between, maybe the truth of that story really is a kind of local family feud, but it becomes bigger and bigger in the retelling. And so eventually it really represents all of the earth.
You mentioned I was intrigued by the fourfold approach to reality, true, not true, and both, etc. And you mentioned, I think a few weeks ago, that you were bringing some of the Hindu insights and seeing whether linkages with current day physics and other scientific aspects. Is that logic aspect any part of it? Yeah,
that logic is, in the West, we sometimes talk about it as what's called paraconsistent logics. And paraconsistent logic in the Western way of thinking about logic really only develops in the 19th century as a science of logic, whereas, of course, in the Indian traditions, it's been around for millennia. It is one of the logics that is the basis of what we now think about as AI research and fuzzy logic, things like that. It's also used in understanding some of the equations in quantum theory. And so this idea that something can be both and neither is probably something really profound, which we're only starting to understand. In the Indian tradition, of course, it's more foundational, but it wasn't really applied to the physical and natural world. It was applied primarily to the social world.
Wonderful. So I expect to see all of you next week.
Yeah.
This is like a cliffhanger.
All the cool stories are coming up, right?
Together.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you all for being here. Since Lil Faider is here, I want to thank Lil for endowing this program over the past 5 years. Thank you for your generosity and your support and your commitment to interfaith work that you've done for decades, and for helping us to really appreciate the value of this. So, Lil, thank you. And thank Dr. Rugrell for another, how should you define this? Illuminating, enlightening lecture. Thank you.
How about weird and boring?
Boring it was. It's weird, maybe.
Yeah, so this was fairly high-tech Indian philosophy. So you're climbing up in the karmic levels by now, right?
Very nice. Please stay and help yourself to some refreshments. Thank you all. Good night.
Thank you.